Welcome back, folks, to the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. On today's show, we have Len Davidson from the Neon Museum of Philadelphia. Yeah, we're going to get a little neon with you, and that's not fluorescent tubes. Stop calling them neon, okay? He is, while teaching organizational sociology at the University of Florida in the 70s, Len Davidson opened a roadside America-themed bar restaurant called The Gamery. Reflecting on this theme, a neon ceiling was erected in the bar, which led Davidson to apprentice at a neon sign shop before moving back to his hometown of Philadelphia in 1979. He gradually left academia, thankfully, and began a custom neon sign business that became a full-time pursuit in 1983. Since the late 70s, Davidson has also collected old neon signs, primarily in the south and northeastern U.S. The collection was named Neon Museum of Philadelphia. We're going to talk about it right now, but before we do, we got to go light thing, right thing, Greg, with Satco. Go to satco.com, Greg Ehrich.
That's right, and we're living life enlightened with the Satco Starfish. Simple, scalable, smart lighting solution connects you to your home for an enriched, improved, enhanced, enlightened life. It's a Wi-Fi connection. It gives you tape lighting, can lights, standard light bulbs, outlets. Everything fits into this system, and it's color changing, dimmable. So you create atmospheres, spaces, define routines, set moods, whatever you need. You can get it done. Color changing, dimming, exterior rated. Satco's got it all, the Starfish.
Yeah, with the Starfish coming out hot, go to satco.com. Of course, proud members of the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. That's right, NAILD.org. Get educated, get associated. What's up, Len Davidson?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Doing well.
So,
Greg, we're going to get into
yeah.
neon here. I mean, lighting distributors hate neon.
Well, you shouldn't hate it necessarily, but we want to talk about it because we have actually never done a podcast on neon, and it's something I don't know all that much about, but I'm actually involved in a neon project now, so good timing. But before we get into all that, your bio said it here, but why neon? What got you so excited about neon? Why'd you get into the business?
Well, when I was doing this bar and restaurant in Florida, we decided, as you mentioned before, to put up neon signs on the ceiling, and it was mesmerizing. It was an incredible bar to begin with Lionel electric trains and kind of a roadside theme. We had a giant figure made by a Mardi Gras craftsman in the front window. But the neon really captured me, and I wasn't going to get tenure. I was spending all my time with this bar. So my last year at Florida, before they were going to kick me out, I went to the sign shop that had made a neon sign for our front and had given us some advice on putting the neon up on the ceiling. And I said, I'll apprentice with you 1 day a week. And it just got more and more interesting. It was interesting both in terms of learning about a new medium. I didn't really know anything about neon very much, other than things I had seen along the road. But it was interesting as sociology too, because the people who were making the neon signs in Florida, and later as I started roaming around throughout the South and through New Orleans, I found lots of kind of what I was considering old timers. Now I'm an old timer, but these were people who had learned neon after World War II. They had a certain ethos, which was kind of a blue collar, very creative way of looking at doing neon signs, and hearing their stories, learning about how they got into the trade, seeing pictures of the signs that they were making. It was sociology to me, but it was something that I gradually, instead of just capturing other people and capturing their stories, I started creating my own stories. I started putting signs together, using neon as found object sculpture, and then designing. I just gradually got more and more into neon. 4 years later, I was totally out of academia and doing neon pretty much full time.
And is that bar that you had still around?
The bar didn't last very long. It was a beautiful place, and students seemed to like it a lot, but we knew nothing about the bar and restaurant business, frankly.
Sure.
So
That's a
we
problem.
had it was a big problem, yeah. We had this great creative idea, and we were able to put together a really interesting bar, but in order to get our liquor license, we had to have a 100-seat restaurant, and that was our downfall. So we would be mobbed on the first 2 floors at the bar, and then we'd be losing more money in the restaurant that we made at the bar. But that's neither here nor there. That's not what you
I never
probably.
understand anyone that enters the food and that business at that level. It's so difficult, man. I'm
It
sure
is. You
people
have to
can
know
make a
what
lot
you're
of
doing.
money, but a lot of people that know what they're doing can make a lot of money doing it. But man, if you don't know what you're doing, I don't think Greg and I had a little foray into a side business that went really south. Let me ask you. So
Hmm.
you sound like you, in a way, became um, enamored or captured by neon as a
Hmm.
technology to convey a message. Um, like it, there's something special about Hong Kong neon. You see the whole city of
Hmm.
Hong Kong is characterized by neon. What is it about neon that in messaging that's so important to you?
Well, for years and years, it conveyed a message. It conveyed heritage, really. So uh, if you go to Hong Kong as an example, the city was just filled with neon. Uh, I'm told that if you rode these outdoor trolley cars in Hong Kong, and a friend of mine who'd been there said, if you held a broomstick up, you could break $1 million worth of neon. It was all over the street. There's different configurations of neon in different cities, but what what initially interested me and what's become more interesting over time has been sort of the heritage that neon uh, relates to the shops, the stores, the restaurants, the buildings that utilize neon and tend to utilize them less today. So at first, it was really just the signs themselves that were very catchy and witty, and they were really kind of a form of folk art. And I learned about it being folk art just from hanging out with these old timers. And if you think about it, um, people who were making neon in the 50s and 60s, they had been exposed to like the golden age of comic books. There were lots of newspapers then. There was lots of cartooning. So the idea of making a sign was not so much to just put words together, but to do pictures. And there was lots and lots of pictorial neon years ago. Um, so that was one of the elements. I've always been interested in folk art, and so that was something that really enchanted me about the signs. Uh,
So, what
but
does the neon sign say, though? What is the medium saying above and beyond the individual things that are written on it or the symbols that are made? What is it saying about Philadelphia, the workshop of the world, and what is it saying?
well, it's a record of the workshop of the world. That I'm glad you bring that up because Philadelphia was between 1850 and 1950 was often called the workshop of the world, and we manufactured lots and lots of things here, and we had tons of small mom and pop businesses that were serving bigger industries and were serving consumers. So if you went every 4 blocks or so through Philadelphia, you would come to a shopping street, and there were individual proprietors there. So what we're uh, we're preserving here is a Philadelphia that really doesn't exist anymore, or only a fraction of it exists. Because if you came to the city now, you might find maybe 4 shopping streets that have mom and pop stores on them, but there's a lack of corner stores. This is a story that's not uh, just um, true of Philadelphia. It's true of the United States. I imagine it's somewhat true of Canadian cities too. Things are now delivered by Amazon. Um, if you wanted to start a business, uh, you wouldn't. A lot of immigrants are starting businesses, I guess, but um, at least in Philadelphia. But the idea of being able to start your own business, hang out your own sign, is something that's kind of lost. So people come in here, and for young people, they haven't seen these kind of signs, and what we do is we show them both the signs, and then we have stories attached to the signs. So what I'm really getting at is neon is telling a story. It's telling a story about um, Philadelphia and the United States before the internet, before commerce changed radically.
It's a symbol of the entrepreneurial shopkeeper.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a symbol of that. Right.
Yeah, and they come in. Their children come in, or their grandchildren come in, and they tell stories. We collect oral history here, so people who know about the signs write stories on 3x5 cards about Horn and Hardhart's restaurant or a hair replacement center. Which I'm looking at the signs as I'm sitting in here. So people come in and they're just mesmerized by the signs visually, and then secondly, they become very interested in the history that the signs connote.
So regarding the technology itself, I have some questions on that. Maybe you can
Sure.
answer, maybe you can't. But when did neon start? What was the first neon application?
Well, the idea of neon signs, or the idea of um, taking, I'm forgetting the name now, of uh, neon, argon, krypton, xenon. There's a classification for those kinds of gases: rare gases, noble gases. So the notion that you could put an electrical charge through those gases and it would glow is actually several hundred years old. But in the early 1900s, people were trying to utilize that idea, and generally the history gets a little muddled, but most people point to a Frenchman in the early 1900s named George Claude, who developed some electrodes that could go on the ends of the tube, and a system for pumping the tubes with neon or argon gas. And the problem previously was that tubes had been manufactured that would give off a glow, but the electrodes would burn out in a short period of time. So Claude perfected a type of electrode that was long lasting. And then he started franchises, and the franchises opened up around the world, Hong Kong, in Australia, in New York, in Los Angeles. There were these Claude neon franchises that were prevalent in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And his patents ran out, and people would steal away some of his employees and start opening up their own neon shops once they learned the technology from him.
Is neon a mercury lamp? Is it mercury vapor that makes it glow?
There are two main gases that are used: neon gas and argon gas. The argon, without any mercury, is like a pale purple color. You put mercury in, and then the mercury vapor heats up, and it makes it into a brighter blue. So when you start looking at the colors of what we call neon tubes, they're not necessarily pumped with neon gas. Generally, reds and pinks and oranges are the neon colors, but you can get many more colors with argon and mercury fills.
How many colors are there, do you know, from neon?
It depends how finely you want to define the color differences. They're different manufacturers. So if you wanted to look at a color like turquoise, there might be 4 manufacturers, each one making a couple of shades of turquoise. So I could say that there's 2 turquoises, or I could say that there's 10 turquoises, based on subtle differences between manufacturers. But overall, the palette that, in the heyday of neon, which is not so much today because it's harder and harder to get to get the different kinds of glass that you'd want to use. But back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, when I got into neon, we were using 40, 50 different colors, different shades.
Is there any color neon can't do?
Yeah, brown. I haven't really seen that. Neon lights are illuminated, so once you get into very dark colors, there is actually a very beautiful bromo blue, a dark blue color. But as you start getting into black kinds of shades and brown sorts of shades. You don't really use neon for anything like that.
And can you explain more on how it operates? I know you talked about the gases mixing, but is there a driver, a ballast involved? What all is
Yeah,
there?
yeah. There's a transformer. So you would take household current, 110, 120 volt current, and traditionally it would go to a transformer that would turn that into high voltage, generally between 3,000 and 15,000 volts, but low amperage, 30 milliamps, 20 milliamps. So you could get shocked by that voltage and you'd feel it, but it wouldn't injure you. Um, and for many years, we were using these big, heavy transformers that had copper coils inside that upped the voltage. Now there's electronic transformers, which are much lighter. Uh, they're producing similar kinds of voltage, but they don't weigh as much. They're safer. They turn off if there's a short in the system. So what they're doing is they're exciting the gas inside of the tube and making the gas glow. And as I was saying before, the main gases that we use commercially are neon and argon, but there's also phosphorescent powders that go inside of the tubes that give you different colors. And there's also basically colored glass or stained glass tubes. So if I wanted to get a red, for instance, I could use a clear tube just with neon gas, and that would give me kind of a red-orange color. But then there's stained glass, red stained glass, and I could get a ruby red color uh, of just clear stained glass, and then I could also put powder inside of that tube and then get a color called coated ruby glass. So there would basically be three typical reds that have been used. But as I was saying, it's harder to get the glass today than it used to be. So if I wanted to get clear ruby or coated ruby glass, it used to be made domestically by Sylvania, by Corning in the United States. And now to get that glass, it's typically imported from, over the years, there's been different countries that have manufactured the stained glass, Italy, Germany. It's just harder and harder to get. And the same thing with the people who are coating the tubes and putting phosphors in the tubes. They used to come out with additional colors every couple of years. If I wanted a kind of not so popular color, it would be hard for me to get that. I might have to buy a big quantity. I used to be able to just call up a distributor and say, I need 3 pounds of a particular kind of turquoise for a job. Now that turquoise might not be available, or I might have to buy it in larger quantity because there's not as much demand for the glass as there used to be.
And that kind of might answer some of my question, but you said 3 pounds. So when you do a sign, do you take the glass and bend it yourself and form it? Or how does it work?
Someone does. I'm not a
Okay.
bender. I'm a designer. So let's think in terms of a big neon shop, and there aren't that many big neon shops anymore. There used to be probably 10 or 20 large shops in Philadelphia. I don't think there is any large shop in Philadelphia. But when you had a big shop, you would have people who would go out and talk to customers. Then those salespeople might come back and make sketches, or they'd go to a design department who would do sketching and would also make full-size patterns. So if you say that you've got a store called Greg's Seafood and you'd like a sign, salesman goes out, makes a sketch, and you might call 5 different sign shops. So one of them is going to say, well, instead of just Greg's Seafood, why don't we do a neon crab or a neon lobster? And another one might say, well, why don't we make the neon crab so that his claws open and close and we animate it? But anyway, that's getting beyond what you're asking. So to fabricate that sign, to make the Greg's Seafood sign, we'd agree on a design. Then a full-size paper pattern has to be made up. That pattern, so you have pattern makers in a big shop. Then the pattern makers take their pattern over to a tube bender. The tube bender fabricates the glass. They use Bunsen burners, specific specialized kinds of Bunsen burners to bend the glass exactly to the pattern, and then they have to fill the glass with the neon or argon put it through a vacuum pump, take out the impurities, and once those tubes have been aged and we know that the neon tubes are good, then it leaves the tube bender and it goes on to uh, installers or kind of fabricators. So you might be doing metal work, plexiglass work. Uh, if your Greg seafood sign is in the shape of a fish, somebody's got to uh, bend the metal to the shape of the fish. Somebody else has to put the transformers inside of that metal box and wire them up, uh, drill holes so that the neon electrodes go into the box and are wired together. And then you go out and you install the sign. So you've got sign installers, people with crane trucks if you're installing a big sign. So there might be 4 or 5 different departments involved in the fabrication of a sign.
All right.
That's
I've
the
got
old
a
days.
number.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I've got a number. I've just always been interested. So, Mike, you can sit back for a while. You'll be involved. So, length. Is there a certain length that neon can run where it has stops, or do you have to go from both ends, or how does that work?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'm not a tube bender, so some of the technical questions about bending, I kind of have a sense of from being around benders, but I don't have perfect information. But what I can tell you is that when I uh, design a tube now, the benders that I take the tube to will tell me they can't really pump them beyond 12, 13, maybe 15 feet at most. And what's interesting is that I collect old neon, and I've got lots of old neon tubes that are 20 feet long. So when I show a 20-foot tube to a bender today, they're sort of amazed, and they talk about, well, maybe that different vacuum pumps then. I don't really know technically why they could make longer tubes years ago than is typically done today, but that seems to be the case. Anyway, if you're, and we're not talking about just the straight tube. We're measuring this tube out. So again, if it's the name Greg, we could make the name Greg and do that in one 20-foot tube, perhaps years ago. Now it might be 2 12-foot tubes or 2 10-foot tubes, whatever.
And what is the life of neon?
The life seems to depend on window washers very much, and on where you're putting the neon. Outdoors, neon is subject to the elements. So if you are a good fabricator and installer, neon signs can last a very long time. They can last 20, 30, 40 years, and they can even last that long outdoors. But you've got to design them in a way so that you protect them from the elements. And not all installers are, equally proficient at doing that, arranging the electrodes so that they don't get water on them, that kind of thing. This same kinds of issues are true when you're doing window signs. You're putting signs in a business on a wall or hanging in a window. They're glass, so they're fragile, but if you just leave them alone, they're again going to last 20, 30, 40 years. The transformer might go before then, but most of the service calls I've had over the past 40 years have been somebody was messing with the tube. A sign is in a window and a customer knocks into the window, or a window washer didn't handle the tube properly when they were trying to move the tube away from the window so they could wash the glass. So there's breakage issues just from not being careful. And it also depends on just the quality of the bending that you did. I've seen new benders make tubes that that last 3 days, or that last a month, or that develop pinholes. With a bender who's got good experience and has been knows what they're doing, I never have that kind of problem, or you have that problem very rarely. So like any manufactured item, you're going to have a little bit of failure, but it really depends very much with neon on the workmanship of the tube bending and the workmanship of the people who are doing the installation.
So with a neon sign, if it's 2 colors, is it typically 2 tubes then? If it's a red and a blue sign, one's a red tube, one's a blue?
Not necessarily. There's 2 different gases, so you can't combine a tube that's pumped with neon with another part of the tube that's pumped with argon, but you can splice colors together, and you can get red not just with neon. You could also get ruby red pumped with argon gas and mercury, and it's a little bit lighter shade, but it's still a red. So I could splice together, or a bender could splice together for me, a whole bunch of colors, uh, pinks, which would typically be done with neon, but you can get uh, argon pinks, reds. You could get argon based reds. So you don't have to necessarily have two different tubes for two different colors.
And how do you determine energy use of a neon sign?
You look at the transformer, and it gives you a rating of how many amps are drawn by the transformers. The transformers that we use now, the electronic ones, are kind of self-regulating. So I might have a transformer that will draw up to 2 amps, but if I use that transformer on a short length of tubing, it may only draw half an amp or a quarter of an amp or 1 amp. So we have amp meters. I've been doing that lately because in our neon museum, we have motion detectors, and the motion detectors have a limit of about 10 amps. So when I put together a bunch of signs and run them on one motion detector, I want to, get a rating and make sure that I'm not approaching 10 amps on those. So, I can measure signs individually and find out how many amps they're drawing, or I can measure a whole group of them together.
And you've kind of alluded to a few things, but is neon still a viable light source?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's. I don't want to give the impression that neon's not being made, but the quantities of neon being made are lower, and the ways neon is used is probably a bit different now. There's a lot more interest in neon artistically. Artists want to use neon, but artists typically don't want to spend 2 or 3 or 4 years burning their fingers and cutting their hands to become a bender. So they might make a design and bring it to a bender and then utilize that in a piece of artwork. To actually be a tube bender takes a long apprenticeship period to get any good. So, but you're really asking me about how neon is used. Um, LEDs have cut dramatically into the market for neon, and as I was saying, where there were dozens of sign shops in a city, there may still be dozens of sign shops, but if I called up 10 sign shops in Philadelphia and said, would you make me a neon sign, 9 of them would say, oh, you don't want neon, you want LEDs. And that's not because neon's not a viable option. There's a lot of reasons. One of the reasons being that there are fewer neon benders around. Sign shops used to have either trade benders they'd bring their patterns to, or in-house benders. They had enough demand for neon that they'd have someone bending the glass in their shop. So for a sign shop that doesn't have a bender and doesn't want to go to the trouble of learning about neon, it's a lot easier to get LED tubes and have them put together. And you typically order them from China. I don't want to get into one medium is better than another, but I will tell you that among neon people, they'll say, well, even a monkey could do LEDs. In other words, it doesn't take the same levels of skill to shape plastic tubes for LED designs as it does to be a tube bender and shape them into neon designs. So that's one of the reasons.
A visible difference? If you look at a sign, can you tell if it's LED or neon?
Yeah, I can, but the average person may not be able to.
Yeah, I've seen some pretty nasty LED neon imitators, like pretty darn good, and they're kind of rubbery too. They have like this rubbery material that you don't need to have any. Like the days of the the Hong Kong man sitting on the corner with a blowtorch and glass, which I've seen pictures of, and he's making this gigantic sign on the side of his apartment building in in Hong Kong. You've seen those pictures? Have you not seen them doing the glass on the side of
I've
the
never
road?
seen anybody doing it outdoors like that. No, I've seen
Oh,
people vending
you
in
have
sign
the in Hong
shops.
Kong. You would see them sitting outside. There'd be laundry
Really?
hanging above them and stuff. Oh yeah,
No kidding. Hmm.
yeah. And but yeah. So, but I mean, is there a different effect? Is it all nostalgia that you continue to use neon, or is there a real benefit in its in its
Well,
deployment?
is there a real benefit in having a craftsman do ornamental plaster work for your ceiling medallions
Mm,
versus getting plastic ceiling medallions at Home Depot and tacking them up to your ceiling? Part of it is the craftsmanship, and we could talk. This is really sociology that we're talking about, but the decline of craftsmanship across the world, at least in Western developed countries. Uh, if I want to get nice brickwork done or plastering done or whatever, it's hard to do. And the same thing with people working with their hands in general and having the skills to do neon. So there's a certain value in the craftsmanship. It does look different. You can see differences, but not everybody's going to see the differences for all the applications. There's also a certain funkiness to neon that I don't see in LEDs, and that gets to what I was talking about before, the animated signs, the cartoony kinds of signs that were done in neon and are still done in neon. We recently did a job for a guy who makes custom fishing rod covers, and we made a 5-point animation where uh, it's in two windows. In one window, the man is casting a fishing rod, and in the other window, there's water, and he eventually catches a fish, and the rod bends in the first window, and a fish pops out in the second window, and it fights back and forth. So there's two fish on two lines. So I don't know if you could actually do that same uh, kind of animation in LEDs, but it wasn't really a question with this customer. He wanted an authentic neon sign. He wanted something that was really spectacular and animated, and we were able to do that for him. So I don't get very involved with LEDs. If you ask me a lot of questions about them, I won't be able to answer them. I've just, at this point in my life, I'm not really trying to make money out of a sign business. And
sure.
if I was, I would probably learn more about LEDs and do some LED signs, but I don't really need to do that. So I'm just focusing on neon at this point.
How does the sign that you just mentioned, how does it change? Is there a timer built into the transformer?
Yeah, there's an animator. So there's 5 different transformers, 3 for
Oh,
the 3 fishing rods, one for the rod going back, one for the rod going forward, one for the rod where his arm comes back and the fishing rod curves because it's caught a fish. So you have 3 transformers for those 3 fishing rods and arm combinations. And then you've got 2 additional transformers lighting up the fish, the 2 different fish. And it's much easier to program animation today than it used to be, oddly enough. And I say oddly enough because there's much less animation. In the heyday of neon, there were tons of animated signs, and they would use mechanical flashers. So you have a motor that would turn around, and it would be attached to fingers that would go up and down uh, and make electrical connections that would run to a transformer and make that transformer go off and on. So the way that you made that program, there were a couple of companies, Time-O-Matic and Sinatrol were 2 that come to mind, where you tell them that I want transformer on for 3 seconds, and then I want transformer 2 on for 2 seconds, and you just give them the pattern, and they would cut out uh, cams on on these mechanical flashers, and they had to time the cuts in the cams to your 2 seconds for transformer number 1 being on, 3 seconds for number 2 being on, and so on. So it was kind of a vanishing skill. I don't even know how how well you could do if you wanted to get those old-fashioned kinds of animators anymore. But there are now companies that will make electronic transformers, and I could just make up a chart with listing my 5 transformers, and it could go over. I've had animations that's run as long as 2 minutes, and just make a graph of how I want the transformers to go on and off over that 2-minute period.
You know
So,
what's interesting, Greg? You want to keep going on that because I want to change gears a little bit and ask.
yeah, let me
Len
just
a
ask
different
one more
question.
thing.
Sure.
Is there such thing then as a neon manufacturer, or is a sign shop technically the manufacturer, taking the components and making it themselves?
Um, I'm not exactly sure what you mean. You're talking about manufacturing the tubes, right?
Yeah, I'm
The,
just trying to relate
peop-
it to the lighting world where there's fluorescent tube manufacturers, there's ballast
the
manufacturers.
yeah, so there are manufacturers um, who make the neon glass typically in 4-foot or 5-foot sections, and then they will coat the glass with phosphorescent powders. So the people who then turn those straight tubes into neon signs are not the same people who manufacture the glass, if that's what you're
Okay.
asking.
Yeah, that is. Yep.
Yeah, and that's
All
what
right.
I was saying. There are fewer of these. I think there are fewer manufacturers, and there's less of that straight glass available to people in the neon business than there used to be. It's not that they're not there, but it's supply and demand's more expensive and longer time periods to get that glass than it used to be.
So this idea of craftsmanship,
Yeah.
the other idea of understanding the physical mechanics of something,
Hmm.
how a machine works, the idea,
Right.
artisanal craftsmanship, this kind of thing. I think your museum is kind of nostalgic for an age of makers and an age of people that understood how mechanical components. Like one of the things I mean, I tried to make a
Yeah.
machine myself years ago. I'm not going to get into it what it was. The
Hmm.
guys that were designing it were all very old, and it was a
Hmm.
mechanical machine that would use
Right.
different things to make a mechanical process, right? And people are very obsessed with bits, computer bits, and this and
Hmm.
programming computers. And there's something lost. Like even when you look at the U.S. space program, they sent those things to the moon on mechanical proficiency, not on like digital electronic
Digital.
proficiency. You know what I'm saying? And so there were
I do.
makers, there were people that knew the tolerances of things in a feel way. Like you're talking about someone who's making an artisanal neon sign, and this is the 50s or the 60s. There would be guys that knew that the glass, if they bent it like this, and if they took the angle
Hmm.
like that, and that's too much of an angle, and then you have people coming to, how the hell did he do that? There's actually people saying like, how the heck did they go to the moon back in? They don't even think they could redo the way they did it back then.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
so is it nostalgia that you have there? What is it that you're kind of longing for?
Well, it's culture. I don't like the word nostalgia, although you could use that word, but it's a different culture when you're manufacturing things mechanically, when you have those hand skills. So when people come into our museum, they're reflecting on a workshop of the World City, where literally there were workshops. People were putting things together. It's not the first time there's been this kind of change. The change towards digital technology. You could look at the Industrial Revolution, where more people were on farms. Uh, there was like hand craftsmanship. People were manufacturing small items out of their houses, and then there was movement away from that form of manufacture, that form of commerce, towards working in big factories. In outside of Philadelphia, we have a museum called the Mercer Museum. Dr. Mercer had the insight around the turn of the century, uh, when people were throwing away their tin snips and uh, their homemade fireplaces and all of that kind of craftsmanship that he was documenting. He was just picking it up. It was of no use anymore because things could now be made in factories, and you could have production lines and knock off thousands of things that it would take individual craftsmen a long time to do. So that was one major change. Once the internet came in, and digital technology came in, the the remaining craftsmen who might have worked for the factories or might have supplied things for the factories, they're dwindling in number as their
We have the same
age
thing
comes
with
up.
lamp parts. Like
Okay.
in Toronto, you used to be able to find lamp part stores, like people that would have make custom
Mhm.
lamp shades, and they would make, they would have all these different kind of lamp components, and people would make custom lamps. But what's interesting is that right now, Japan and Germany and parts of northern Italy and Switzerland and France and these countries, they have a bunch of companies. In Germany they're called Mittelstand, and in Japan they have a name for them. And I was reading an article on one of these companies, and one of these Japanese companies makes scissors for hairdressers. And the owner of everyone in the factory is over 60 years old. There's no young
Mhm.
people in there, and they make they make scissors and export them, like $7,000 pair of scissors or something like that. Okay, so
Mhm.
that's what you're talking about. And the owner of the factory is like, yeah, every pair of scissors we make has its own personality. So he's saying
Uh-huh.
stuff like that. And it depends on who makes it. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not going to start pretending I know Japanese names, but he was listing off the different craftsmen.
Yeah.
He's got 100 of them in the factory, and they get orders for these scissors. And he's like, yeah, everyone has their own personality, and they come in a special box, and it's beautiful. This tool is beautifully made. And Germany has tons of these kinds of things, and so does Italy and France. And these businesses are going out of business. Like
Mhm.
there's nobody to take on the management of the business. Not because they don't make quality products, it's because they don't have any craftsmen. They don't have
Yeah.
anybody that wants to start in their 20s and start making scissors every day for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And
We have the same thing. Exactly the same issue. Kids who might be good at working with their hands are not really encouraged to do that. They're told to go to college.
mhm,
So instead of, in the neon business, there were families. Your your father or your uncle might have been a tube bender or might have worked in a sign shop, and then they bring the kids along. But uh, the businesses die off because the young people don't want to go into those family businesses anymore. They're not as interested in being craftsmen. They're interested in getting college education and doing something that they see as more professional.
yeah, like taking on $200,000 worth of debt when you're 21 years old. That sounds like a great plan.
Sure, wonderful.
Um, yeah, I got a piece of paper that says I'm smart, but no, I mean, I'm not gonna make fun of that too much. But I think there's a problem with inflation in academia and in the
Mhm.
institution right now in terms of cost and value proposition on the other end. But that's a whole other
Yeah,
conversation. But yeah,
it
so
is a big
there's
conversation.
yeah, it's a different conversation. But the craftsman's ethic has not. I mean, Greg, what did you call it when we dump the stupid men in the trades or something? You told me we were talking to this one.
Mm.
Where were we? We were talking to someone. I'm like, huh? I mean, a bricklayer, makes a hell of a lot of money in Toronto right now. I think it's like $85 an hour these guys command to show up on a job site. And I don't. I think that we're not doing a good enough job in I don't know if honor is the right word, but giving craftsmen and tradesmen a sense of contribution to the society that matters, and it's inherent in what they do. You build a home. What a beautiful home. Who built that?
Mhm.
Building things is very, very important. And so I really enjoyed our conversation, but it made me reflect on not just the lighting industry, but then on a larger issue of the our society seems to be valuing one thing over another without any real evidence that the one thing is better than the other, if that makes
Absolutely
sense.
true. Yeah, it totally makes sense. I couldn't agree more. And an example in that my father was a school teacher, and it was obvious to my parents that I should go to college. I ended up getting a PhD, but I always had a knack for working with my hands. I
Mm.
had uncles who were shop teachers, and so it just seems like the fate worked out to take me away from teaching college students and talking to undergrads who didn't want to necessarily be in the classes anyway, to actually making something with my hands that uh, I could see the product of my labor. It was much more
Hmm.
satisfying to me. But I'm really the exception. The opposite is my wife was a counselor at a community college, and she had tons of kids who would come into the community college and they were not really academically oriented, but they were pushed to go to college, and they might have been wonderful as bricklayers or as plumbers or as electricians, and they could have perhaps made as good, if not better, salaries doing that than pushing themselves into academic disciplines that were not really what they were geared towards. So
So,
it's a societal issue that you're talking about.
and before we let you go, I do have two questions on the museum itself.
Please, yeah.
How many neon signs are there?
Well, in the room that I'm in, there's, I don't know, 110, something like that. We have a hallway. We're part of a block-long building, and the space that I was given, it was not really big enough for the collection. So I negotiated that I could put another 25 signs in this hallway. The ceilings are about 25 to 30 feet tall in this building, so there's plenty of room there. And then we have another building, which is part of Drexel University, and we've got another 30 signs over there. We call that our annex. You don't pay anything to go over to Drexel. You just walk around the windows and you see the signs in these large windows in a former Firestone building. But here overall, there's probably, I don't know, 130, 140 signs that you could see in the museum and in the corridors, the shared corridors here.
And this could be in the museum or anywhere, but what is your favorite neon sign of all time and why?
Well, I have different kinds of favorites. To my left, there's a giant neon hot dog from a place called Levis's Hot Dogs. And it was made by perhaps the greatest sign man in Philadelphia history, a guy named Joe Feldman, who made just incredible signs. People told stories about the signs that he made. But anyway, that's one reason I like the hot dog. But the other reason is that in the 1950s, my father kind of got me addicted to basketball. We used to go to see the Philadelphia Warriors. So I'm really dating myself because now the Warriors are in Golden State. Anyway, that was in West Philadelphia, and there was this hot dog place that my father went to and that his father went to. And so that after the basketball games, he would take me over to Levis's, and you'd get a hot dog and a fish cake there. And it was a business that had started in 1895. It had giant murals on the walls for people who were in the 50-year club, who had been going to Levis's for 50 years. It was such a ground-in part of Philadelphia that when the place closed, people were just brokenhearted. And when we got this neon sign, we put it up on top of the building, and we had a Levis's 99th anniversary relighting ceremony. And hundreds of people flooded the particular bar where we put the sign on top of. So from a sentimental standpoint, Levis's is my favorite. But it's not really aesthetically the most fantastic sign. It's a giant hot dog. You know, we've got, I have a 4-point animation sign here from a photo supply company from the 1950s where the aperture of the camera opens and closes. That's one of my favorites, just for the aesthetics of how they designed that sign. And it's a double-sided 50s camera built in metal. So that would be another type of favorite. But I can go on and on. I've got, it's like asking who's your favorite kid. They all have their positive and negative qualities, but they're all favorites in some ways.
Well, Len, it's been a pleasure to unpack this. Neon signs are, they each of them, I guess, they have their own story, and what you're saying there is each of these signs represents somebody's life work or something that meant something to somebody. And
yeah, I just want to pull one of these down. We have these guide cards here. So every wall of the museum has cards that tell you stories about the signs. I'd written a book called Vintage Neon, and this museum is really an outgrowth of it, where the book shows the signs and then tells you the stories about the business, the sign maker, and so on. So that's what our guide cards are here for too. And I'm glad you're picking up on that the signs are not just signs, they're representatives of culture, and they tell stories.
Well, folks, I'll tell you this. When my kid was playing rep hockey, Greg Ehrich, we'd go to all these little towns in Ontario, and they would all have these little weird museums with stuff. You canoe museums, tool museums from lumberjacks in Ontario, and you'd see the tools they would use. Visit museum, folks, because there's always some sort of cool theme, and you can extrapolate it further. But before we extrapolate any more, we got to talk about the gangsters, Greg Ehrich at Satco. Go to satco.com. That's Satco Light Thing, Right Thing, Greg.
That's right, and we talked about telling stories. Now, theirs is LED. It's not neon, but you can do that with their Starfish. They have bulbs, string light, tape light, recess cans, outlet switches, color changing, dimming, exterior rated. You can transform your house with their system, so check it out.
And of course, proud members of the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. Go to naild.org. That's right, get associated if you made it to the end. Our colleagues and friends for listening, we thank you always. This is coming out in the new year, but I'm going to say Happy New Year to you. Bye for now.